Good evening, guys. Tonight we're going to be talking about vision, or the way in which our eyes receive sensory information from the world, and then the way in which we process that information to make sense of the world. So our eyes receive stimulus in the form of light energy. So this light energy enters our eyes, and then it's transducted or transformed into neural impulses, so then our brains can do stuff with it. So the way in which it's transformed depends on the type of light, so which depends on the wavelength, which means how much of a frequency it has, the hue or color, the intensity, meaning how bright it is, and the wave amplitude. So if you look at this spectrum of light, we humans only perceive this narrow sliver on the spectrum. So on one side you have ultraviolet rays, on the other side you have infrared rays, but we only perceive very little of it. So what type of light we see depends on the wavelength primarily. So a high frequency will be interpreted as bluish colors. A long wavelength or low frequency will be interpreted as reddish colors. And in the same way, a great amplitude will be perceived as bright colors, and the opposite will be perceived as dull colors. So our eyes transduce these different frequencies or wavelengths into different types of neural impulses. That's what's important. So there's different parts of the eye, as you can imagine. It's an extremely complex organ. So these different parts perform different functions. So we have the cornea, the pupil, the iris, the lens, and the retina. And then there's this process of accommodation, which the eye's lens, which we'll look at, changes shape to focus near or far objects on the retina. So that's kind of like a lens on a camera. So let's just look at these different structures. The cornea is this outer covering in the eye. It's kind of just like the outer film layer, like a contact kind of is. And you may have scratched your cornea. That's a common injury to the eye. Then we have the pupil, which is that black part in the middle of your eye, which is adjustable. It kind of opens and closes based on how much light is in the area. Now the iris, that's the pretty part of our eye. That's the colorful part. And this is a ring of muscle that actually is what does the contracting or dilation of the pupil. So the iris is the muscle that dilates or constricts the pupil, and it's the colored part. So that cornea is the outer part, the pupil is the black part, the iris is the colorful part. Then we have the lens, which is this transparent structure behind the pupil that changes shape to help focus images on the retina. Remember that process of accommodation that I referred to. So light enters through the pupil, the lens then adjusts based on how much light there is, and then this gets reflected back onto the retina. Now the retina is this light-sensitive inner surface of the eye, all the way in the back of the eye, as you can see, which contains these receptor rods and cones, which we're going to look at, plus layers of neurons that begin the processing of visual information. So the retina is where the sensory data is first sort of entering in the process of transduction, which eventually leads us to perception. So these rods and cones that I were talking about, these perform different functions for the retina. They're sensory organs, basically. So rods and cones, they function differently. As you can see, there are much more rods than cones. There's 30 times more. So cones are located in the center, rods are located on the periphery. Cones have a low sensitivity in dim light, rods have a high sensitivity. And in the same way, cones have a high color sensitivity, rods have a low color sensitivity. And cones can sense detail better than rods. Now cones are located in the center, so that's why it's more sensitive to color and detail. When we look at something directly, we can focus on the color, we can focus on the detail very acutely. Now if you pay attention to what's on the periphery, on the kind of outsides of your eyes, it's not very detailed, it's not very colorful. So rods and cones kind of function differently. They interpret different sensory data. So here's how the retina actually works. So you can see right here, the back of the eye, that's the retina. That's what's being shown right here. So the light enters through the pupil. When it reaches when it gets reflected through the lens back onto the retina, here's what happens. It hits these rods and cones, which then transform it. So the eye triggers photochemical reactions in rods and cones. So based on what type of light it is, these rods and cones activate these bipolar cells. And these bipolar cells then activate these ganglion cells, the axons of which conform or converge to make this optical nerve. Now the optical nerve is important because that's what transmits this information to the brain, to the visual cortex via the thalamus, which is this switchboard which sends information where it needs to go. So just to sum up, the light enters the pupil, hits these rods and cones. The rods and cones react based on which type of light it is. Then it sends it back to these bipolar cells and the ganglion cells. And the ganglion cells actually create this optic nerve. And this optic nerve is where the channel where this information is sent to the brain. All right? So there's this blind spot, though. And this blind spot is the point at which the optic nerve leaves the eye, which creates a blind spot because there's no receptor cells located there. So if we look, this area where this optic nerve is, right here, there's no receptor cells. So this is a blind spot in our vision. But we also have this fovea. And this fovea is the central point in the retina, around which the eye's cones cluster. So the optic nerve, as I said, this optic nerve carries information to the visual cortex via the thalamus. So everything that is interpreted by the retina goes to the optic nerve, to the thalamus, and then to the visual cortex. Now let's just look at this in depth again. So we have light coming in, here's the eyes, it hits this back of the retina. The retina then sends the information to the optic nerve, which gets processed by the visual area of the thalamus, which then finally gets sent to the visual cortex, and that's where the brain actually perceives things. So all of this is sensation until we get back here to the visual cortex when the brain actually interprets the information that it's being sent. So when the visual cortex is activated, it has to detect features so it knows what it's looking at. So this feature detection, or feature detectors, are nerve cells in the brain that respond to specific features of the stimulus, such as shape, angle, or movement. And different parts of the brain, different parts of the visual cortex, interpret different things, or interpret them better, as you can see. So all of these things are happening at the same time. It's called parallel processing. So this is when many aspects of a problem are processed simultaneously. So this is the brain's natural mode of information processing, including vision. So all of this is happening at the same time. We're perceiving color, motion, form, depth, all these things at the same time, but in different parts of the brain. So that's why we call it parallel, because it's happening at the same time in different processing modes, rather than step-by-step or serial processing, which most computers and conscious program. We're not going step-by-step. Everything's happening at the same time. So let's take a look at how this visual information processing occurs in this visual cortex. So we see something, there's the scene. The retina processes it via the rods and cones, which then gets sent to the bipolar cells, the ganglion cells, which sends it to the optic nerve. And then the optic nerve sends it to the thalamus, which sends it to the visual cortex, which is where feature detection occurs. So the feature detector cells respond to specific features, like edges, lines, and angles. So then this parallel processing occurs, where the brain cell teams, different parts of the brain that are devoted to detecting different things, combine information about color, movement, form, and depth. So then this results in recognition. The brain then interprets the constructed images based on the information from stored images. So it compares it to things that were previously processed, and then it's like, oh, okay, that's a chair. Oh, okay, that's a student. So this is the visual information processing process. So color vision, there's different theories as to how this actually occurs. So this young Helmholtz trichromatic theory states that retina contains 3 different color receptors. One sensitive to red, one is sensitive to green, and one is sensitive to blue, which, when stimulated in combination, can produce the perception of any color. If you look at your Roy G. Biv wheel, there's primary colors and there's secondary colors. It's kind of based on that. there's also this opponent process theory that says that opposing retinal processes, one red-green, one yellow-blue, one white-black, enable color vision. For example, some cells are stimulated by green and inhibited by red, and others are stimulated by red and inhibited by green. And so when we process color, there's this kind of after image. If you ever looked at the sun for too long, if you stare at something for too long, and you close your eyes, it's kind of still there. So this is a visual illusion in which retinal impressions persist after the removal of the stimulus. And this is believed to be caused by the continued activation of the visual system. So the after image may be positive, corresponding in color or brightness to the original image, or negative, being less bright or of colors complementary to the original. So it's kind of the opposite in the negative sense. So a common after image is the spot of light one sees after a camera flash has been fired, or the sun. So here's a little demonstration. So stare at this image for 30 seconds. Focus on the dots in the middle for 30 seconds. Now close your eyes and put your head back. And what do you see? If you kind of blink your eyes back and forth, now that's pretty creepy. That's after image. So last but not least, there's what's called color constancy. And this is a feature of the human color perception system, which ensures that the perceived color of objects remains relatively constant under varying illumination conditions, meaning different types of day, different kinds of light. So for example, a green apple, for instance, looks green to us at midday when the main illumination is white sunlight, and also helps at sunlight when the illumination is red. So this helps us identify objects. So if you look here, despite there being different color, it kind of remains the same. There's a little bit of variation, but there's constancy. So we can identify objects regardless of the light source. All right, ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our lecture on vision. Stay tuned for more. Have a good evening.